Seven Towers, where, having landed her cargo, she was permitted to resume her own colors, and was thus the first vessel to hoist the American Union in the Thracian Bosphorus. In 1812, however, the Dey, finding his funds at a low ebb, and receiving from all quarters reports that a wealthy American commerce was afloat, determined on trying them with a new war. He was peculiarly unfortunate in the time chosen, as the States, having about a month previously declared war with Great Britain, had, in fact, withdrawn most of the merchant ships from the sea, so that the only prize which fell into the hands of the Dey's cruisers was a small brig, with a crew of 11 persons. The time at length came for putting an end to these lawless depredations, and peace having been concluded with England, President Madison, in 1815, dispatched an American squadron, under Commodores Bainbridge and Decatur, with Mr. Shaler as envoy, on board, to demand full satisfaction for all injuries done to American subjects, the immediate release of such as were captives, the restitution of their property, with an assurance that no future violence should be offered, and also to negotiate the preliminaries of a treaty on terms of perfect equality, no proposal of tribute being at all admissible. The squadron reached its destination early in June, and, having captured an Algerine frigate and brig of war, suddenly appeared before Algiers, at a moment when all the cruisers were at sea, and delivered for the consideration of the Divan the terms on which they were commissioned to make peace, together with a letter from the President to the Dey. Confounded by the sudden and entirely unexpected appearance of this force, the Algerines agreed on the 30th of June to the proposals of a treaty, almost without discussion. It had long been a reproach to Great Britain, the mistress of the sea, that she had tamely suffered a barbarian power to commit such atrocities, ravages on the fleets and shores of the minor states belonging to the Mediterranean. At length a good cause was made for chastising them. At Bona, a few miles to the east of Algiers, was an establishment for carrying on a coral fishery, under the protection of the British flag, which at the season was frequented by a number of boats from the Corsican, Neapolitan, and other Italian ports. On the 23rd of May, the feast of Ascension, as the crews of all the boats were preparing to hear mass, a gun was fired from the castle, and at the same time appeared about 2,000, other accounts to say 4,000, infantry and cavalry, consisting of Turks, Levanters, and Moors. A part of these troops proceeded towards the country, whilst another band advanced towards the river, where the fishing boats were lying at different distances from the sea, and opening a fire upon the unfortunate fishermen, who were partly on board and partly on land, massacred almost the whole of them. They then seized the English flags, tore them in pieces, and trampling them under foot, dragged them along the ground in triumph. The men who happened to be in the country saved themselves by flight, and declared that they saw the soldiers pillage the house of the British vice-consul, the magazines containing the provisions, and the coral that had been fished up. A few boats escaped, and brought the news to Genoa, whence it was transmitted by the agent of Lloyd's in a dispatch dated June 6th. No sooner had the account of this atrocious slaughter reached England than all ranks seemed inflamed with the desire that a great and signal punishment should be taken on this barbarian prince, who was neither restrained by the feelings of humanity nor bound by treaties. An expedition, therefore, was fitted out with all speed at Portsmouth, and the command entrusted to Lord Exmouth, who, after some delays from contrary winds, finally sailed July 28th, with a fleet complete in all points, consisting of his own ship, the Queen Charlotte, 120 guns, the impregnable rear admiral, Sir David Milne, 90 guns, Minden, Superb, Albion, each 74 guns, the Leander, 50 guns, with more frigates and brigs, bombs, fireships, and several smaller vessels, well supplied, in addition to the ordinary means of warfare, with Congreve rockets and shrapnel shells, the destructive powers of which have lately been abundantly proved on the continent. August 9th, the fleet anchored at Gibraltar, and was there joined by the Dutch Admiral Van Capellen, commanding 5 frigates and a corvette, who had been already at Algiers, endeavoring to deliver slaves, but being refused, and finding his force insufficient, had determined on joining himself with the English squadron, which it was understood was under way. Meanwhile, the Prometheus, Captain Dashwood, had been sent forward to Algiers to bring off the British consul and family, but could only succeed in getting his wife and daughter, who were obliged to make their escape disguised in midshipman's uniform, for the Dey, having heard through some French papers of the British expedition, had seized the consul, Mr. Macdonell, and put him in chains, and hearing of the escape of his wife, immediately ordered the detention of 2 boats of the Prometheus, which happened to be on shore, and made slaves of the crews, amounting to 18 men. This new outrage was reported to Lord Exmouth soon after leaving Gibraltar, and of course added not a little to his eagerness to reach Algiers. He arrived off Algiers on the morning of the 27th of August, and sent in his interpreter, Mr. Salame, with Lieutenant Burgess, under a flag of truce, bearing a letter for the Dey, demanding reparation. Meantime, a light breeze sprung up, and the fleet advanced into the bay and lay to, at about a mile off Algiers. It was now, says Mr. Salome, in his entertaining narrative, 2:30, and no answer coming out, notwithstanding we had stayed half an hour longer than our instructions, and the fleet being almost opposite the town, with the fine breeze, we thought proper, after having done our duty, to lose no more time, but to go on board and inform his lordship of what had happened. Mr. Burgess, the flag lieutenant, having agreed with me, we hoisted the signal that no answer had been given, and began to row away towards the Queen Charlotte. After I had given a report to the admiral of our meeting, the captain of the port, and our waiting there, etc., I was quite surprised to see how his lordship was altered from what I left him in the morning. For I knew his manner was in general very mild, and now he seemed to me all fightful as a fierce lion, which had been chained in its cage, and was set now at liberty. With all that, his lordship's answer to me was, "Never mind, we shall see now," and at the same time he turned towards the officers, saying, "Be ready," whereupon I saw every one with the match or the string of the lock in his hand, most anxiously expecting the word "Fire!" No sooner had Salome returned than his lordship made the signal to know whether all the ships were ready, which being answered in the affirmative, he directly turned the head of the Queen Charlotte towards the shore, and to the utter amazement of the Algerines ran across all the batteries without firing or receiving a single shot, until he brought up within 80 yards of the south end of the mole, where he lashed her to the mainmast of an Algerine brig, which he had taken as his direction, and had then the pleasure of seeing all the rest of the fleet, including the Dutch frigates, taking up their assigned stations with the same precision and regularity. The position in which the Charlotte was laid was so admirable that she was only exposed to the fire of 3 or 4 flanking guns, while her broadside swept the whole batteries, and completely commanded the mole and marine, every part of which could be seen distinctly from her quarter-deck. Up to this moment not a shot had been fired, and the batteries were all crowded with spectators, gazing in astonishment at the quiet and regularity which prevailed through all the British ships, and the dangerous vicinity in which they placed themselves to such formidable means of defence. Lord Exmouth, therefore, began to conceive hopes that his demands would still be granted, but the delay, it appeared, was caused by the Algerines being completely unprepared for so very sudden an approach, insomuch that their guns were not shotted at the moment when the Queen Charlotte swept past them, and they were distinctly seen loading them as the other ships were coming into line. Anxious, if possible, to spare unnecessary effusion of blood, his lordship, standing on the quarter-deck, repeatedly waved his hat as a warning to the multitudes assembled on the mole to retire, but his signal was unheeded, and at 3:15 in the afternoon the first gun was fired at the Queen Charlotte from the eastern battery, and 2 more at the Albion and Superb, which were following. Then Lord Exmouth, having seen only the smoke of the gun before the sound reached him, said with great alacrity, "That will do. Fire, my fine fellows!" And I am sure that before his lordship had finished these words, our broadside was given with great cheering, which was fired 3 times within 5 or 6 minutes, and at the same time the other ships did the same. This first fire was so terrible that they say more than 500 persons were killed and wounded by it, and I believe this, because there was a great crowd of people in every part, many of whom after the first discharge I saw running away, under the walls like dogs, walking upon their feet and hands. After the attack took place on both sides in this horrible manner, immediately the sky was darkened by the smoke, the sun completely eclipsed, and the horizon became dreary. Being exhausted by the heat of that powerful sun to which I was exposed the whole day, and my ears being deafened by the roar of the guns, and finding myself in the dreadful danger of such a terrible engagement, in which I had never been before, I was quite at a loss, and like an astonished or stupid man, and did not know myself where I was. At last his lordship, having perceived my situation, said, "You have done your duty, now go below." Upon which I began to descend from the quarter-deck, quite confounded and terrified, and not sure that I should reach the cockpit alive. For it was most tremendous to hear the crashing of the shot, to see the wounded men brought from one part, and the killed from the other, and especially at such a time to be found among the English seamen, and to witness their manners, their activity, their courage, and their cheerfulness during the battle. It is really most overpowering, and beyond imagination. The battle continued to rage furiously, and the havoc on both sides was very great. There were some awful moments, particularly when Algerine vessels so near our line were set on fire. The officers surrounding Lord Exmouth had been anxious for permission to make an attempt upon the outer frigate, distant about 100 yards. He at length consented, and Major Gossett of the Corps of Marines eagerly entreated and obtained permission to accompany Lieutenant Richards in the ship's barge. The frigate was instantly boarded, and, in 10 minutes, in a perfect blaze. A gallant young midshipman, although forbidden, was led by his too ardent spirit to follow in support of the barge, in which attempt he was desperately wounded, his brother officer killed, and 9 of the crew. The barge, by rowing more rapidly, escaped better, having but 1 killed. About sunset, the admiral received a message from Rear Admiral Milne, stating his severe loss in killed and wounded, amounting to 150, and requesting that, if possible, a frigate might be sent him to take off